Hafa, good evening, and thanks for tuning in to PNC's News First. We're live from the Broadcast Center at Kanta. I'm Clint Rajal.
And I'm Jolene Tovis. Topping our newscast today, GMH employees were hanging on by a thread today, but a crisis was averted just minutes before the end of business day. CEO Peter John Camacho says they were able to meet net payroll. However, as PNC Janela Carrera reports, the payroll crisis was only revealed last night at a board meeting, which drew the ire of board member Ricardo Terlahi, who lectured the administration for only giving them a day's notice.
Because we have about $600,000 in the account as of this morning. And if we don't get money from DOA tomorrow, we won't meet payroll.
At the first board meeting held in months, GMH CFO Benita Manglotnya revealed that they were severely short. They only had $600,000 in the bank, but they needed $3.5 million to meet gross payroll today, or $2.7 million to meet net payroll.
I wanted to let you know that we don't really have much options.
This drew the ire of Board of Trustees member Dr. Ricardo Terlahi.
My interpretation is the CFO brought a critical matter to the board one day before the matter becomes critical. What exactly is the solution? Did you think of a solution? You're presenting something one day before it becomes critical. I don't understand how the board. Are you expecting help from the board?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't have a solution to find 2.7. I don't know how they do in the government to find $2.7 million in a day.
Manglotnya explained that the threat of a payless payday is nothing new. In fact, it's a threat they face every pay period. So if that's the case, what makes this pay period any different?
This has always been the case. I mean, this has been a problem for the hospital for a long time, but because of the situation with the government, and we've been making calls to see what they're going to give us tomorrow, and I'm not getting a response.
I'm really a little offended when people come to the board one day ahead and say this is a crisis and we need all this $2.7 million. What are we supposed to do? We should have, if it's every time and you didn't get the budget, we should have been fighting for the budget when we got cut. Way back then.
We have been fighting for it, and
we just need that little bit of amount.
Ideas were floated during the board meeting, like ending an MOU with the Department of Corrections to provide clinical services, which is costing GMH hundreds of thousands of dollars a month due to non-payment. Others include appealing to insurance agencies and CMS. None of these ideas, however, would be felt immediately. After lecturing the GMH administration on its ineffective lobbying efforts, Dr. Terlahi then made this suggestion.
Maybe we need to have a payless payday for someone to listen. That, and then like people are going like, hey, I'm going to quit. The doctors, the emergency room's not going to be staffed. Everyone's going to have to go to another hospital. We're closing the hospital because everybody quit. Maybe that has to happen before somebody wakes up and says, we really should have paid them. We really should have found that $3.5 million in somebody else's coffer that didn't need it.
This morning, the hospital administration sent out a memo to all of its employees, which read, quote, due to the challenges we face in collecting monies owed to the GUAM Hospital Authority, release of paychecks may be delayed today. Please know that our fiscal services staff and management will continue working with our payers to make sure we are paid what is due to the GMHA. We request your patience and understanding as members of the hospital management continues to address this challenge as expeditiously as we can, end quote. This afternoon, GMH CEO Peter John Camacho told PNC that they were seeing additional funds come through, but it was not enough to meet full payroll. Janela Carrera, PNC News.
Some GMH employees who did not want to be identified said GMH staff were frightened, and some were even in tears at the thought of a payless payday. Meanwhile, Camacho says they were able to meet net payroll by collecting $400,000 from insurance firms and an influx of cash from DOA of $1.3 million. Meanwhile, the Attorney General's office is warning GMH not to terminate an MOU it signed with the Department of Corrections. At a GMH board meeting last night, board member Dr. Ricardo Talahi suggested terminating the MOU this hospital signed with DOC for clinical services. The agreement was signed in July 2015 in an effort to avoid slipping into a federal receivership. GMH provides the medical services to the prison population, and DOC is supposed to pay for that service. But GMH CFO Benita Manglona says in recent months, DOC has not made payments since their priority has been on security in light of the recent death attacks and their aging facilities. This has cost GMH hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Spending money in the hospital didn't sound like they were going to be a debt, that we're going to be losing money on that contract at all, right? So now that we hear, this is like everything that we hear, but we're losing all this money. As soon as you find out that you're losing money and you're wasting and you're spending money in the hospital you don't have, that you can't afford, then you should have terminated the MOU. Put them in federal receivership. We're trying to do them a favor to be federal receivership, but you can't afford it.
AG Elizabeth Barrett Anderson, however, warns that terminating the MOU will undo all the progress they've made in ending a 27-year-long consent decree. She warned, quote, "This government cannot afford to be thrown back into federal court. I fully acknowledge the board's financial situation. However, revoking the MOU may further exacerbate the financial crisis of our territory," end quote.
Senators continue discussions on Senator Joe San Augustine's Bill 248 that would create a 2% sales tax in what is now the 8th special session that has been called by the governor to deal with the fiscal crisis.
So now we're sitting here with the sales tax in front of us, a sales tax bill in front of us, and I remember everyone saying that this was more palatable because it was more transparent. You can see it on the receipt at the end of your purchase that this 2% is added on to your purchase.
Testimony from the business community during yesterday's public hearing on Bill 248 leaned towards the implementation of some form of a sales tax if a tax increase was necessary. Local businessman Carlos Camacho provided a case study impact showing the average cost a 2% sales tax would add to the average resident's budget.
Food costs and other expenses that total a little over $1,200. And I'm just going to assume that maybe this is a month, right? I don't know anybody who spends $1,200 on food and expenses a month. But a 2% on top of that is only $25.
Or if you spend $600 a month on groceries, then the 2% sales tax would cost you an additional $12 a month.
So I keep trying to wrap my head around why people keep saying this is so devastating. I don't understand it. So when I saw it in actual numbers, I started to understand more that maybe it really isn't as devastating as people think it is. They're only led to believe that it is by saying it's a 50% increase. So if it's a temporary solution and it's something that's going to get us through this fiscal crisis at this moment, then I say we should support it.
Senator Joe San Augustine added an amendment to his bill that would require that sales taxes be reported and paid monthly, similar to the business privilege tax. Senator Frank Hogan Jr. proffered an amendment that would allow the governor to reorganize the government of Guam. It's essentially what was proposed in his Bill 247, or the Government Priorities Act of 2018. The measure and the amendment establishes education, health, and public safety as the top priorities of the government, and it removes impediments to GovGuam reorganization. Basically, it would allow the governor more authority to shrink the size of the government by abolishing or combining agencies, eliminating positions, and reducing the size of the GovGuam workforce. Senators were still debating Senator Uggan's GovGuam reorganization amendment when they recessed at 5 p.m. until Monday at 9 a.m. Senator Adam made the motion to recess, saying that they would, quote, finish off this bill on Monday. A Southern High School parent says he's concerned that the water fountain at his son's school may not be safe to consume. Joe Charfris was at his son's parent-teacher conference when he decided to take a drink from a water fountain. What he tasted, he said, was enough for him to spit it out, saying his son even called it, quote, sewer water. Charfris says he now understands why his son usually brings a couple bottles of water with him to school. However, he's concerned for the students who may not be able to bring water to school or who may forget.
They're going to go to the school the whole day without water, they're going to be dehydrated. They're not focusing on school anymore. They're focusing on, gosh, I'm thirsty.
DOE spokesperson Isa Baza responded, saying Southern High School has 39 water fountains that are in working order, and they provide safe drinking water to students. School administrators tested the water quality after hearing of the complaint to confirm the water fountains were working and provided water that was not distasteful or otherwise concerning. Baza adds that there has not been any complaint regarding water fountain quality raised at the school level.
A drug dealer and his mule were set to be sentenced in district court this morning, but after nearly 2 hours in court chambers, the court agreed to only move forward with sentencing the drug dealer. And that sentence has now set a precedent for future drug cases. Timothy Duenas has been addicted to drugs since he was 19 years old when he first began smoking ice. Since then, he escalated from not only being a drug user, but a drug dealer. Now 32 years old, he stood before District Chief Judge Francis Tidinko Gatewood, awaiting sentencing for smuggling over 400 grams of methamphetamine into the island. While he stood to gain $147,000 from the sale of the drugs, his drug mule Caitlin Scully's arrest left him with facing up to 12 years in prison. In court today, legal counsels went back and forth discussing whether or not Duenas should benefit from the Safety Valve Act, which is normally provided to defendants who sign a plea agreement and provide substantial assistance to the government. The act allows for a downward departure from sentencing. Simply put, it allows the defendant to serve less time than the charge calls for. The issue in Duenas' case is that he did not take a plea. Instead, he proceeded with trial and was convicted on the charges against him, charges that would put him behind bars for 12 years. However, after a nearly 2-hour meeting in the judge's chambers, it was determined that Duenas qualified for the Safety Valve Act based on a sealed report that he submitted to the government, providing them with, quote, substantial information, end quote, which would assist them in their ongoing investigation. As a result, instead of facing 12 years in prison, he was looking at 63 months to 78 months incarceration. Before he was sentenced, Duenas was given an opportunity to make a statement, to wit, quote, this is my first time being charged with anything. I would just like a second chance at life, end quote. A second chance is just what he will get after completing a 63-month prison sentence in Oregon. As part of this, he is to take part of the drug treatment program, which, if completed successfully, will reduce his sentence by 1 year. After completion of his incarceration, he will be placed on 5 years supervised release. Meanwhile, Scully's sentencing has been continued to March 27th to allow her family to be present. You can read more online at pacificnewscenter.com.
Senator Talina Nelson yesterday introduced a bill that would require the Port Authority of Guam to comply with the payment in lieu of taxes or pilot payments to the general fund. As PNC's Melissa Leon Guerrero reports, Port General Manager Joanne Brown calls this bill very, very destructive to the port.
Pilot payments are stipulated in Public Law 18-15, which states that autonomous agencies, namely the Port Authority of Guam, the Guam Power Authority, and the Guam Airport Authority, must transfer the aggregate sum of $3.5 million from operating surpluses to the general fund by the end of each fiscal year. Nelson's bill puts a temporary moratorium on allowing the port to enter into any bond covenants until they comply with that requirement. In a conversation with Patty on the radio this morning, Port General Manager Joanne Brown said what this bill essentially does is ask the port to raise its rates so it can contribute that money into the general fund.
That's what it comes down to, because, this money doesn't come out of the air. I mean, we actually have to generate that. We have to pay for our operations. We have to ensure that we're economically and financially sound in order to operate, because certainly the general fund is in no position to absorb or provide any type of financial support to the port, to address its operations or even the upgrades to the facilities that are needed.
The moratorium, meantime, puts a monkey wrench in the port's current plans to float $72 million in revenue bonds. Brown says that money is needed to fund the agency's operations.
We have operational needs to meet, It's important. The port is a critical utility. It's critical that that port stay in operation. It's critical that that port be financially sound. And I think the perspective of destabilizing the entire government, that's the way to go. I don't agree.
Brown and a team from the port are scheduled to meet with their bond counsel and other attorneys in San Francisco next week to go over their final indenture documents needed before they go to market. For PNC News, I'm Melissa Leon Guerrero.
Although GPA and GIAA are also legally obligated to make pilot payments, Nelson says enforcing them to do so would be in violation of their existing bond covenants. Senator Nelson's bill also requires that future bond covenants be entered into in accordance with Guam law.
Local authorities cracked down on a home where methamphetamine was allegedly being sold. That raid has led to the arrest of 5 individuals. Earlier this year, police received information identifying Brandon Mateo and Dwayne Mateo as drug traffickers dealing ice out of their home in Estumbo Dededo. After receiving the tip, court documents state that surveillance was conducted on the residence. As they watched the home, officers noted a vehicle arrived at the residence. Police say that the occupant met with Brandon in the garage area of the residence and then departed. According to court documents, the officers followed the vehicle and conducted a traffic stop as a result of a traffic violation. The operator of the vehicle, police say, voluntarily informed the officers that ice was present in the vehicle and that he had just purchased it from Brandon Mateo, further saying that Brandon had 5 grams of ice in his possession. With this information, a search warrant was obtained and effectuated on March 8. In the home, officers discovered a substantial amount of money, drug paraphernalia with suspected methamphetamine residue, and prescription pills identified as acetaminophen and hydrocodone. Officers subsequently arrested Dwayne Mateo and Brandon Mateo. Their investigation also resulted in the arrest of 3 other individuals identified as Francine Mateo, Jacine Mateo, and Danielle Sanchez, who were found in possession of drug paraphernalia containing suspected ice residue. All have been charged with possession of a Schedule II controlled substance. Dwayne and Brandon were additionally charged with possession with the intent to deliver.
Another claim of sexual abuse at the hands of a Catholic priest who was in charge of confirmation classes at the Asan Parish nearly 34 years ago has been filed. The victim, identified with the initials JMR, was 15 years old at the time and a student at the Nino Perdido y Sagrada Familia Catholic Church in Asan when he was allegedly sexually abused and molested by now deceased Father Ray Tachira. The court complaint states Tachira had become upset at a question JMR presented during class and instructed him to go to his office and wait for him after the class. After the class was over, it is alleged that Tachira went to his office where he instructed the boy to stand in the prayer position. As JMR stood there, Tachira, court documents state, began unbuttoning the boy's pants and removed his underwear. He then instructed him to close his eyes and allegedly began fondling and masturbating JMR. The complaint further states that Tachira began to perform oral sex before digitally penetrating the minor. JMR is seeking $5 million in exemplary and punitive damages.
Well, don't go anywhere. We have your local weather forecast up next with Joycelyn Atalik.